With 2 drill sites in Western Canada, Surge Energy is a smaller player in the oil and gas industry. So it's been trying to insulate from tariffs by selling its oil before they take effect.
A sudden decision to halt the flow of Canadian oil to the United States has created a seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape, rattling the foundations of one of the world's most significant trading relationships. The move comes shortly after a newly inaugurated U.S. President Donald Trump pushed through aggressive tariffs on trade partners, citing a need to protect domestic industries and boost American manufacturing. The announcement of these tariffs sent shockwaves through global markets, but few anticipated the magnitude of Canada's response. The unexpected nature of this shutdown has brought the complexities of cross-border collaboration into sharp relief, revealing how precarious even the most long-standing partnerships can become when confronted with drastic policy changes. Tensions have escalated at a dizzying pace, leaving politicians, business leaders, and ordinary citizens on both sides of the border scrambling to assess the short-term and long-term implications of this extraordinary situation. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Observers have noted that for decades, Canada and the United States shared a mutually beneficial relationship that revolved heavily around the trade of natural resources, especially oil. This relationship was so robust that it was often taken for granted as an unbreakable bond, particularly given the deep integration of energy infrastructure connecting the two countries. Refineries in the Midwest and other regions relied on a steady influx of Canadian crude to keep prices stable and meet consumer demand. The steady flow of oil across the border, channeled through extensive pipeline networks, represented a critical pillar of North American energy security. Analysts long held the view that neither party had much incentive to disrupt this arrangement. So the abrupt decision by Canada to suspend oil exports served as a stark reminder that assumptions about stable supply can be upended by shifting political currents. The new U.S. president's approach to trade, featuring steep tariffs on imports of steel, aluminum, and other goods, caught Canadian leaders off guard. They grappled with the realization that these tariffs might signal a broader shift away from a cooperative North American framework. Officials in Ottawa felt blindsided, given that Canada and the United States had historically addressed trade disputes through negotiations under established agreements. The long-term partnership anchored by treaties such as NAFTA, reworked over time into newer frameworks, underscored a legacy of integrated markets. Nonetheless, the wave of tariffs introduced by the American administration hinted at an era of heightened unilateralism. Canadian policymakers began considering a range of countermeasures, from mild diplomatic protest to the most extreme forms of retaliation. Few predicted the latter scenario would come to pass so quickly or with such force. Political analysts emphasized that the decision to halt oil exports was not taken lightly. The energy sector is a major component of Canada's economy, supporting jobs and contributing significantly to its export revenues. Cutting off oil deliveries to the United States risks major repercussions for Canadian provinces reliant on strong energy revenues, such as Alberta and Saskatchewan. Yet the sense of alarm sparked by the U.S. tariffs, which threatened to undermine key manufacturing sectors in Ontario and Quebec, galvanized a resolve within Canada's leadership. There was growing sentiment among officials and the public that conciliatory gestures were ineffective against what they perceived to be mounting economic aggression from south of the border. Thus, the choice to suspend oil exports was presented as a necessity born out of self-preservation and a declaration of sovereign power in the face of escalating commercial pressure. Some viewed the shutdown as purely symbolic. They contended that Canada might reopen the oil taps within days if certain concessions were negotiated or if tensions eased. Yet the shock value of the action could not be overstated. Energy markets thrive on predictability and stability, and halting such a crucial supply line introduced uncertainty that rattled commodity prices. Oil futures saw immediate volatility, with traders trying to predict how swiftly refineries in the United States might adapt to the sudden shortfall. The sense of unpredictability brought new risks to investors, who struggled to interpret how long the standoff might last, and whether it marked the beginning of a broader realignment in North American energy dynamics. Critics within the United States began to urge the new administration to reconsider the tariffs that triggered this response. They argued that cutting off a vital energy source could drive up prices at the pump, create supply shortages, and ultimately hurt the very manufacturing sectors the administration sought to protect. A spike in energy costs could erode the competitiveness of American businesses, especially those reliant on transportation, logistics, and heavy industry. The quick reaction from U.S. industry leaders underscored how deeply interwoven the Canadian oil supply had become in the American economic fabric. Some pointed to possible alternative sources in the global market, but pivoting away from such a secure and geographically proximate supply chain would take time and money. New infrastructure or shipping routes would need to be arranged, and sudden changes in the supply chain rarely happen without hiccups that can translate into higher costs passed on to consumers. Conversely, nationalists on both sides of the border voiced approval for the tough approach. In the United States, advocates of economic isolationism celebrated that the American administration was standing firm on tariffs, viewing them as a tool to assert national interests. They believed that a short-term oil supply shock would be tolerable if it eventually led to better trade terms and a more robust domestic energy policy. Meanwhile, in Canada, certain factions applauded the government's strong retaliation, commending leaders for refusing to be bullied by what they perceived as unjust American trade practices. This abrupt and forceful policy demonstration was, in their eyes, a clear statement that Canada would no longer operate as a passive partner, unthinkingly tethered to its neighbors' economic demands. Speculation swirled about the behind-the-scenes discussions that led up to the decision. Some reports suggested that high-level phone calls between Canadian ministers and their U.S. counterparts broke down acrimoniously. Others pointed to the frustration of Canadian negotiators who felt stonewalled whenever they tried to carve out exemptions or compromise on the tariffs. Whispers of a strong Canadian backlash circulated within diplomatic circles for days before the official announcement, but few anticipated the form it would take. The interplay between trade policy and energy policy had rarely been so stark. The net effect was a realization in Washington that Canada held a major leverage point through its capacity to influence one of America's most essential resources. Economists have pointed out that from a Canadian perspective, cutting off oil exports carries inherent risks. The United States is the largest customer for Canadian crude, and losing that market, even temporarily, translates into reduced revenues. If prolonged, it could inflict financial stress on producers who might need to idle operations or reroute supply. Nevertheless, these short-term economic pains were weighed against a broader strategic objective. By emphasizing its willingness to make sacrifices in defense of fair trade practices, Canada was signaling that the status quo was no longer tenable. The hope among certain Canadian decision-makers was that this shock would bring U.S. policymakers to the negotiating table with fresh urgency and a recognition that aggressive tariffs could no longer be deployed without repercussions. The immediate reaction in financial markets was swift and dramatic. Oil prices saw a brief surge as traders re-evaluated North American supply lines. Company stocks in the energy, transportation, and manufacturing sectors also experienced turbulence. Risk analysts pored over data, trying to gauge whether this shutdown might introduce a lasting shift in energy procurement strategies. Some energy conglomerates that had diversified supply chains took the opportunity to emphasize their global networks, assuring clients they could secure replacement sources. Smaller refineries and businesses, however, did not have the luxury of pivoting so quickly. They faced potential production slowdowns if the shutdown persisted, which could ripple into layoffs and local economic disruptions. On the Canadian side, public sentiment was mixed. Public opinion polls taken in the immediate aftermath showed a surge in national pride among certain demographics, particularly those who had come to see the U.S. administration's tariffs as an affront to Canadian sovereignty and economic well-being. Others expressed worry about the fallout if the disruption dragged on. Industries reliant on American imports or integrated manufacturing processes could feel collateral damage if tensions continued to escalate. Despite these concerns, commentary in many Canadian media outlets emphasized that every country has its red lines. It was suggested that if the U.S. government insisted on imposing measures deemed harmful or unfair, Canada was justified in deploying its own economic arsenal. politicians south of the border grappled with a rising wave of frustration from constituents. Some lawmakers, particularly those in states heavily dependent on cross-border trade or reliant on Canadian oil, urged the administration to moderate its tariff stance. These officials were more acutely aware of how integrated their local economies had become with Canada's resources, labor, and consumer markets. Others, more ideologically aligned with the protectionist approach, doubled down on the notion that the standoff could pave the way for American energy independence. They argued that it might push the United States to accelerate domestic drilling, pipeline construction, and investment in alternative energy sources, ultimately reducing reliance on imports over the longer term. International observers were quick to note the broader ramifications of this power play. Countries around the world watched closely to see whether the rift between the two longtime allies would widen or narrow. The question loomed: would other nations also consider halting exports of crucial commodities if they felt unfairly targeted by American trade measures? The potential for a new wave of resource nationalism introduced another layer of complexity into global commerce. Diplomatic correspondents warned of a domino effect, where each new dispute could trigger further retaliation, thereby unraveling the intricate web of partnerships that sustain the international marketplace. Energy experts weighed in on the logistical aspects of the shutdown. The intricate network of pipelines and railway connections that linked Canadian oil fields to U.S. refineries represented a remarkable feat of engineering and investment. Shutting down these flows was not as simple as flipping a switch. Industry professionals wondered whether the closure involved halting pipeline operations entirely or drastically reducing throughput. In either scenario, the ramifications for pipeline companies could be significant. Meanwhile, local communities situated along these routes would feel the ripple effect of any operational changes, as transportation schedules, labor needs, and environmental monitoring all became subject to abrupt shifts. The situation also sparked discussions on the long-term viability of North America's integrated energy framework. For years, policymakers promoted the idea of North American energy independence, envisioning a harmonized system that made the continent self-sufficient and less reliant on overseas suppliers. The current shutdown revealed the fragility lurking under the surface of that vision. The fierce unraveling of cooperative ties illustrated how political disputes could quickly override the technical and economic logic behind such integration. While some insisted that the crisis was just a blip, others wondered whether it would catalyze a deeper realignment, prompting each country to reevaluate its reliance on the other and consider forging alternative partnerships or ramping up domestic capacities. In the realm of climate and environmental policy, some activists saw a silver lining in the shutdown. They argued that curtailing the flow of oil might, even temporarily, encourage a shift to cleaner energy sources. Renewable energy advocates in both countries suggested that this sudden disruption could serve as a wake-up call, proving the vulnerability of fossil fuel dependence. Yet the immediate crisis was more focused on the economic and diplomatic ramifications, leaving environmental discussions as a secondary topic. Still, the chain reaction of supply disruptions often motivates businesses and governments to examine ways of diversifying their energy mix, spurring investments in solar, wind, or biofuels when conventional petroleum sources become less secure. Businesses in related sectors scrambled to adapt. Trucking companies, airlines, and manufacturers reliant on petrochemical products all looked for ways to buffer themselves against potential shortages or price spikes. Some decided to lock in contracts with alternate suppliers, even if at a premium, just to ensure continuity. Others reduced output in anticipation of higher fuel costs. The unpredictability made planning difficult, and many CFOs struggled to revise budgets and forecasts on short notice. Meanwhile, legal teams on both sides prepared for the possibility of lawsuits if contracts for oil deliveries were abruptly broken. The complexity of such cross-border legal battles and the interplay of international trade law raised the specter of lengthy courtroom dramas. Political watchers noted how swiftly personal relationships between leaders could sour when faced with disruptive policies. The newly elected U.S. president had campaigned on promises to protect American jobs and renegotiate trade deals deemed unfavorable. This resonated with segments of the U.S. electorate, but it also alarmed neighboring countries, none more so than Canada, which had long thrived within a stable framework of regulated trade. The extent of Canada's willingness to retaliate, shutting off an essential commodity, showed that the era of measured diplomacy could give way to harsh economic signals if the administration pressed too hard. Some questioned whether the two countries had the diplomatic skill to rapidly diffuse this crisis, or if entrenched viewpoints would harden into a protracted stalemate. The narrative quickly captured public imagination, transcending typical news cycles that focus on domestic squabbles. Social media platforms were flooded with commentary, speculation, and memes about the standoff. Many Americans expressed shock that a friendly neighbor like Canada could take such an extreme measure, while Canadian voices on those same platforms emphasized that they were left with little choice. Hashtags about the oil shutdown went viral, amplifying opinions across a wide political spectrum. Some comedic takes tried to lighten the mood, but the seriousness of the potential economic fallout loomed large for countless business owners and workers whose livelihoods were now caught in the crossfire of a trade war they neither started nor sanctioned. Logistical complexities grew more apparent with each passing day. Tanker trucks destined for U.S. markets turned around at the border. Pipeline operators received last-minute directives, and port facilities reeled from the sudden redirection of shipments. Each step in the supply chain had to be re-coordinated or halted altogether, in the face of new instructions. Ports along the Gulf Coast that often handle blending or additional refining steps watched the horizon for new shipments that might not arrive. U.S. refineries scrambled to purchase crude from other regions, potentially from domestic shale producers or overseas sources. But that shift incurred extra costs and introduced time lags. With so many moving parts, the complexity defied quick resolutions. Economists who focus on trade policy noted that neither Canada nor the United States could be considered the outright winner in this confrontation. Both faced downside risks if the situation escalated without compromise. The U.S. administration, though emboldened by its campaign promises, now confronted a scenario it might not have fully envisioned: a major ally using one of the few instruments of leverage at its disposal. Meanwhile, Canada, by enforcing such a drastic embargo on oil shipments, also risked damaging the trust and rapport that underpinned its biggest export market. The longer the shutdown continued, the more likely it would be that new patterns of trade would emerge to fill the gap, possibly reshaping the competitive landscape in ways that could disadvantage Canadian producers over the long term. Within Canadian political circles, arguments raged about whether the decision could have been handled more subtly. Some officials voiced concerns that a full shutdown was too extreme, proposing targeted limits or conditional cutbacks instead. Others believed a bold move was necessary to shake the confidence of the newly elected U.S. administration, effectively broadcasting that Canada was ready to defend its economic interests. This internal debate became a microcosm of larger questions about the future of global trade in an era of resurgent protectionism and high-stakes brinkmanship. At the heart of the matter lay a fundamental question about the efficacy of retaliatory strategies in forcing reconsideration of unilateral policy actions. Speculators debated how the president would react to such a direct challenge. Known for his combative rhetoric on social media, the American leader had already showcased a willingness to engage in public feuds, sometimes overshadowing behind-the-scenes negotiations. Given the significance of oil to American life, from fueling cars to producing a range of consumer goods, the public and the press waited to see if there would be new threats or if the administration would adopt a more measured tone. Some guessed that the standoff might prompt the White House to revisit its tariff policies or offer Canada certain exemptions, while others believed it would lead to further punitive measures or additional tariffs. Other world powers observed the developments with keen interest. European countries, long used to transatlantic tensions, regarded the new U.S. president's trade posture as part of a broader shift in American foreign policy. They also watched how Canada managed the crisis, noting that an effective stance might set a precedent for other nations caught in trade disputes with Washington. Emerging economies from Asia to Latin America likewise weighed their options, contemplating whether this kind of resource-based retaliation could become a new norm if traditional avenues for dispute resolution became ineffective. The scenario provided a cautionary tale about the fragility of global supply chains in an era where national interests could override established treaties and norms. Within local communities that produce oil in Canada, the reaction was nuanced. Workers realized that a halt in exports could jeopardize their income if refineries and pipeline operators scaled back operations. Yet many shared a sense of unity with their government, believing that standing firm was essential for the country's dignity and fairness in international trade. The dissonance of wanting to support national strategy while safeguarding personal livelihoods created an emotional tug-of-war. Leaders of labor unions and municipal governments in these regions tried to provide clarity and reassurance, though they had only limited information about how the crisis would unfold. This atmosphere of uncertainty weighed heavily on families whose paychecks were intricately linked to the cross-border energy trade. In turn, American industries started to sound alarms about the potential ramifications. Petrochemical plants in the Gulf Coast region, refineries in the Midwest, and distribution networks across the country all faced the prospect of disruptions. Some could pivot to alternative suppliers, but for many, Canada had always been the most logical and cost-effective source of crude. Even those with alternative supply contracts worried that global price fluctuations could strain profit margins. Political pressure began to build within the U.S. as energy sector donors and lobby groups pressed the administration to find a pathway toward diffusing the tension, lest it cause long-term damage to American businesses and the wider economy. Pro-trade advocates in both countries lamented what they saw as a needless escalation. They argued that the foundation of North American prosperity had been built on robust cooperation and that disputes should be handled through negotiation, arbitration, or existing frameworks rather than tit-for-tat maneuvers. However, the momentum behind the shutdown seemed to overshadow such voices of moderation, at least in the immediate term. The surge of national sentiment in Canada and the pride in a new American administration determined to fulfill campaign promises formed powerful political forces that were not easily reversed. Each side cast itself as defending legitimate interests, and the space for middle ground appeared narrow in the heated climate. Policy watchers questioned how soon the two governments might resume formal talks. Some of the most influential figures in the U.S. cabinet had not held senior government positions before and were thus untested in high-pressure international negotiations involving a crucial resource like oil. Canada, for its part, had diplomats experienced in trade talks from previous agreements, but the abruptness of the new administration's approach required a different strategy. The interplay of personalities, national pride, and economic urgency created a unique challenge. Negotiations would likely require multiple rounds of haggling, each shaped by the swirl of public opinion and corporate lobbying. Social media continued to amplify tensions, but it also provided a space where some North Americans called for calm, reminding citizens of the cultural and familial ties that bound the two nations. Cross-border families worried about what further deterioration in relations might mean for travel, employment, and the broader sense of unity that had long characterized the U.S.-Canada border regions. Students, professionals, and retirees who regularly crossed the boundary for work or leisure found themselves following the news avidly, uncertain if the diplomatic clash might eventually lead to expanded controls at crossing points or additional restrictions. The emotional fabric that had stitched the two countries together for generations strained under the weight of an increasingly hostile political landscape. Meanwhile, private negotiations among business leaders in both countries sought ways to mitigate the damage. Firms that had built their supply chains around Canadian oil joined forces to push for a swift resolution. Canadian energy executives also kept lines of communication open, mindful that restoring the flow of exports was in their long-term commercial interest. Yet none dared to openly contradict their government's stance, lest they be perceived as undermining the national interest. The result was a patchwork of silent overtures, closed-door meetings, and urgent lobbying that took place in the shadows of an unfolding public drama. The tension was not confined to the energy sector alone. Allied industries such as automotive manufacturing, machinery, and technology braced for ripple effects, fearing that the shutdown might provoke more retaliatory measures. If the trade war escalated, it could lead to a cascade of tariffs or additional embargoes on other commodities. The entire economic relationship between Canada and the United States, once the envy of the global community, seemed to teeter on the brink of a complex reconfiguration. Supply chains that took years to build were under threat, and businesses large and small dreaded the prospect of an unpredictable new normal. Economists and political scientists scrambled to analyze the historical precedents, pointing to previous disputes such as softwood lumber or agricultural products. However, none matched the scale and symbolism of halting oil exports. Energy is not just another commodity, it is the lifeblood of modern economies, central to everything from transportation infrastructure to consumer electronics. This gave Canada's move extraordinary weight, eclipsing past disagreements and leaving no doubt about the seriousness of the message. The real question centered on how effectively this demonstration of power might alter the U.S. administration's trade agenda, or whether it would simply entrench an adversarial posture. A segment of the public on both sides did hope for quick negotiations. They argued that this break in the relationship represented an opportunity to fix long-standing grievances and to craft a more balanced approach to trade that included environmental and labor protections. They envisioned modernized agreements and dispute resolution mechanisms that could better handle 21 century challenges. Yet the urgent nature of an oil shutdown, with its swift economic impact, left little time for idealistic overhauls. Most anticipated that any diplomatic breakthrough, if it came, would revolve around pragmatic steps to restore the flow of energy and dial back the tariffs. The shock from this shutdown served as a stark reminder that even the strongest alliances can be vulnerable to political shifts. A host of assumptions had guided cross-border trade for decades, including the idea that essential resources would never be used as leverage. This assumption was now thoroughly disproven. Observers began to wonder whether nations worldwide would take note and re-examine their own dependencies on trading partners. Questions arose about whether a more protectionist climate would encourage self-sufficiency, or whether globalization had advanced too far for such abrupt severances to be truly feasible. In any case, the Canada-US oil shutdown stood as a cautionary tale of how quickly cooperative frameworks could unravel when exposed to unilateral policy moves. Now the focus remains on the immediate reverberations and the scramble by politicians, diplomats, and industries to find workable solutions. Each hour that passes without a resolution intensifies the sense of urgency as supply chains tighten, inventories dwindle, and the threat of inflationary pressures grows. Public patience is tested whenever the cost of living increases or jobs appear at risk. Politicians attempt to manage expectations and maintain their messaging, asserting that the standoff is either a necessary phase in protecting national interests or an unwelcome crisis caused by unjust policies. The swirl of rhetoric leaves many uncertain about where truth lies and what measures could feasibly end the standoff without either side feeling humiliated. The sense of a turning point pervades conversations on both sides of the border. Media outlets run round-the-clock coverage, feeding speculation about closed-door negotiations or potential policy concessions. Commentary ranges from alarmist scenarios of prolonged economic disruption to more measured takes that see the conflict as a bargaining chip in a broader renegotiation of trade rules. Financial analysts remind everyone that the global oil market is vast, and that while North America might suffer temporarily, other suppliers and consumers could step in, shifting the balance of power in ways that are difficult to predict. The unpredictability and complexity of the situation add to the fervor, leading some to describe it as the most momentous clash between Canada and the United States in modern history. All eyes watch for any indication that Canada might ease its stance or that the new U.S. administration might temper its tariffs. Politicians issue statements reiterating their commitment to protect national interests. Yet behind the scenes, staff members frantically produce policy options, seeking a resolution that maintains dignity and upholds economic stability. The shock of the oil shutdown has laid bare the raw dynamics of power and dependency in North American relations. It has also revealed how quickly a single action can reverberate through interconnected systems, upending the expectations that once made these ties appear unbreakable. An entire continent stands poised for whatever comes next. The complicated web of pipelines and trade routes has long symbolized cooperation, unity, and mutual reliance. Now, as pumps go idle and shipments are withheld, the nature of that reliance is tested. Canadians experience a surge of national pride mingled with economic anxiety, while Americans wrestle with the realization that a cornerstone of their energy supply was never guaranteed. every conversation about the future acknowledges that the shutdown marks a pivotal moment. Whether it results in a strengthening of negotiations, a drift toward new alliances, or a deeper fracture that redefines the region's economic architecture remains an open question. Diplomats, economists, and industry leaders face the tasks of navigating the immediate crisis and considering the broader implications for regional and global trade. The entire episode highlights the constant tension between national sovereignty and international cooperation. As each side stands firm, the tension underscores how quickly disagreements over tariffs can escalate into game-changing disruptions in vital resource flows. The standoff demonstrates that what began as a trade dispute has become something far larger, a test of wills and a test of whether the historic bonds that tie Canada and the United States together can endure a direct challenge to their economic interdependence. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Canada shutting down oil supply to the US? What do you expect will happen next? Thank you for watching and see you next time.